Rome did not collapse because of outward forces such as the barbarians, but because of inward rottenness.
It's a terrible question. What's the deal with the left and pedophilia? From pro-pedo articles to MAPS, that's an acronym standing for Minor Attracted Person, which is a euphemism. Cover-ups, apologia, I never know how to pronounce that word, etc. It's an alarming correlation. Furthermore, I predict trans and non-binary will soon be eclipsed by a push for its, pedophilia's, acceptance.
Yeah, so this is a complete disaster.
Yes.
Those who have predicted that this would arise have been correct. The scope of it is quite scary, and maybe most scary of all is the fact that this is now, as the question implies, being taken seriously.
Even if you are looking for a threshold, let's say there's a threshold. I'm making this number up, but let's say it's at age 8. Still, that tells you that some adult child sex is permissible. Second, the notion that it's wrong even with a 1-year-old is not quite obvious to me. It's hard to see what would be wrong with it. So, yeah, I guess I think, no, I don't think there's a blanket period beyond which this is permissible.
The opulence of Rome was here at Avanches. This gold bust of Marcus Aurelius was found here. Rome left its magnificent treasures in art and architecture across the whole empire. In many ways, Rome was great, but it had no real answers to the basic problems that all humanity faces. When a culture tries to build only on its military strength, very, very soon, these will prove not to be sufficient, for the simple reason that without a sufficient base of knowing what is right, what is wrong, why we should do certain things in contrast to why we should do certain others, no amount of military might is sufficient. Rome first tried to build upon the decisions of accepted citizens of the Republic.
But people think they're being like inclusive or something. That's sort of. I think I've seen that in some of the sort of the so-called intelligentsia.
Imagine that an adult male wants to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. Imagine that she's a willing participant. A very standard, very widely held view that there's something deeply wrong about this, and it's wrong independent of it being criminalized. It's not obvious to me that is in fact wrong. I think this is a mistake, and I think that exploring why it's a mistake will tell us not only things about adult child sex and statutory rape, but also about fundamental principles of morality.
And later on the decisions of its emperors. But the attempt ultimately failed because it was not a sufficient base on which to build a society. And they never had the kind of democracy we have, where everybody shares in it. But for those who were the real citizens of the state, they just tried to build on their opinions.
And all these bloody governments, including the provincial governments in Canada, have started to rely on nothing but opinion polls as a means of sampling what the public thinks.
And this totally failed.
But there's a question about what it means that they think they're being inclusive. I don't think they're being inclusive. I don't think they think they're being inclusive. I think they're being bullied into accepting it because they will be stigmatized as non-inclusive if they don't.
Okay, well, I think that's the same thing, but I get your distinction. That they can't quite put their finger on why it's not a free speech issue or something. And so they say, well, maybe it's just a sexual orientation.
So it's fairly widespread among young men, particularly young men in our society. Second, you see it in the hunter-gatherers, right? You see it in all sorts of cultures that are quite different than our own, in places like New Guinea and things like that, Melanesia. And third, you see it historically, right? It was true in adult-child sex, true in ancient Japan, ancient China, ancient India, Egypt, even Great Britain. And you see in our closest cousins, the bonobos. Right? Bonobos are the closest to us genetically.
And then they turned to their gods. But their gods were not big enough because they were finite. That is, they were limited. They were like bigger men and women, not basically different from human men and women. They were amplified humanity, not divinity. This being so, the Romans had no sufficient base intellectually. That is, they did not have anything big enough or permanent enough to which to relate either their thinking or their life. Therefore, they had no value system strong enough to bear the strains of life, either individual or political. All their gods together could not give them a sufficient base for life, morals, values, or final decisions. The Romans made their own gods depending upon their society, and when the society tumbled, their gods tumbled with them. Thus, the Roman experiment in social harmony, based on an elitist republic, ultimately failed. The Senate no longer could keep order. Armed gangs terrorized the city of Rome, and the normal functions of government were disrupted as rivals fought for power. Self-interest took the place of social interest, no matter how sophisticated the trappings. Thus, in desperation, the people accepted authoritarian government. In the days of Julius Caesar, Rome turned to an authoritarian system centered in Caesar himself. As Plutarch put it, the Romans made Caesar dictator for life. After Caesar's death, Octavian, later called Caesar Augustus, grandnephew of Caesar, came to power. Because Augustus offered external and internal peace, while keeping the outward forms of legal constitutionality, Romans of every class were ready to allow him total power.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act
in order to restore and assure the functioning of the political system, of business, and the affairs of daily life. Augustus tried to legislate morals and family life. Later emperors tried impressive legal reforms and welfare programs. But a human god was a poor foundation, and Rome fell. It is important to realize the difference a people's worldview makes to their strength as they're exposed to the pressures of life. Let us not forget why the Christians were killed. They were not killed because they worshiped Jesus. At that time, many religions were practiced in the Roman world. Some were called the mystery religions. Here, for example, we can see one of the initiatory rites practiced by one of these religions depicted in this Roman house in Pompeii. Nobody cared who worshipped whom, as long as the unity of the state was maintained, centered in the worship of the emperor. The Christians were killed because they were rebels, and this was especially so as they lost the support of the Jewish synagogues, and therefore the immunity which the Jews had since the time of Caesar. We may express the nature of this rebellion in two ways, both of which are true. We can say they worship Jesus as God, and they worship the personal, infinite God only. This worshiping of the one God only, Caesar could not tolerate. It was counted as treason. As their empire ground down, the Romans, in their decadence, were given to a great thirst for violence and the gratification of their senses, as in their rampant sexuality.
When I said in the main part of the podcast that we were failing children on many fronts, this is one of the most important, and people who think that this is some minor fringe weird thing ought to rethink it, because this is heading at civilization like a freight train. And of course, our most fundamental obligation is to protect children from predatory adults.
Let's do the adult child sex. That's always a big seller.
Oh yeah. Well, that
I had good friends who said, "Are you crazy? Do not write that book."
man, listen, you're talking to a guy who for 25 years has been making arguments more or less in defense of adult child sex in classrooms.
Here in Pompeii, a century or so after the Republic had ceased to exist, the phallus cult was strong. Paintings and statuary of exaggerated sexual content adorned the houses of the affluent. Not all the art in Pompeii was like this, but that which was of sexual representation was just plain blatant.
Adult males and underage males, that it's not harmful, or if it is harmful, we can't decide whether the harm is due to the sex itself or the fact that society goes berserk over it.
You were confusing throughout the years about whether I should be with a woman or a man because of what they did to me.
Culture and the freedoms of men are fragile. If there's not a sufficient base, it only takes time, and often not a great deal of time, before there is a collapse. That it was the Christians who were able to resist the religious mixtures, syncretism, and the effects of the weaknesses of Roman culture speaks of the strength of the Christian worldview. This strength rested on God being an infinite personal God, and that he had spoken in the Old Testament, the revelation through Christ, and the gradually growing New Testament, and that he had spoken in a way that people could understand. This meant that they not only had knowledge about the universe and mankind, which people could not find out by themselves, but they had absolute universal values by which to live and by which to judge the state in which they lived. And people are unique in being made in the image of God. There was a reason for the basic dignity and value of each individual. If they had worshipped Jesus and Caesar, they would have gone unharmed. But they worshipped one God only and rejected all forms of syncretism. There was no mixture. All other gods were seen as false gods. Or we can express why they were killed in another way. No totalitarian authority, no authoritarian state can tolerate those who have an absolute by which to judge that state and its actions. Rome collapsed, not from external, but from internal weaknesses. Apathy was the chief mark of the period. The elite abandoned intellectual life for their social life.
Our most fundamental obligation is to protect children from predatory adults. We do a terrible job of this. It's not just pedophiles. We also don't manage to protect our children from corporations that study their behavior and sell them things that are bad for them and all of that. So we have a long history of failing children in this regard, but we're about to fail them at a new level, and it must not be allowed to happen.
All of life was marked by the prevailing apathy. And as the Roman economy slumped lower and lower, burdened by a costly government and by inflation, authoritarianism increased in order to try to set off the apathy. And as less people were inclined to work, the state took over more and more freedoms were lost. For example, laws were passed binding the small farmer to his land. And because of the apathy and its results and the oppression, few people thought the old civilization was worth saving. Rome did not collapse because of outward forces such as the barbarians, but because of inward rottenness. And Rome gradually became a ruin.